to the third webinar. And we thank you for following South Institute on our social media, especially our Facebook page, our Twitter page, and those who've been sending us feedback. We really appreciate those feedback, and it has indeed informed our subsequent webinars. Today, and for many people who wanted to join and hear, the people said, I can't look forward to seeing Phil, Karolina, Sarah, Eric, and Sanjukta. They're all here with us today, and these are great researchers who've been battling a lot of work as far as trying to build knowledge and produce knowledge on issues to do with sexual violence against men and boys in the context of forced displacement. This is our third webinar, and we are happy that you're here with us. I can see we have 8 panelists and 21 attendees. We look forward to receiving others as they do join, and we are live right now as we speak. We also have other followers sending in their comments on the chat, but we look forward to a much productive conversation. Today, as you can see from our panelists, they look very energized, and greetings to all of you. Only I wish we could be physical in one place. Today we have Eric. Eric can wave to our participants. Eric is right there with us. Eric is from Seattle and a PhD student in the Center for Gender Studies at the University of London. That is SOAS. I was once at SOAS as well. So for our SOAS followers, we are fully represented here. His doctoral research explores the values, understanding, and assumptions that humanitarian practitioners and organizations in Jordan draw on to form their recognition and response to Syrian male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So he's right here with us. He will be telling you a lot of his work and his research as far as the state of the field in research, the challenges, and key findings from things that he has been doing. We also have with us none other than Sanjukta, who is a final year PhD scholar. Sanjukta is right there with us. You can see the name. From the Center of International Politics, Organization, and Disarmament from Nehru University in Delhi in India. She's working on gender, violence, and conflict, examining male victimhood and conflict-related sexual violence in international relations. I think that's for the first time we're having somebody trying to connect the conversation of sexual violence in as far as international relations is concerned. She's so keen in looking at the idea of gender and male victimhood in international relations. So we can't wait to hear what her research is all about and the key findings and some of the challenges. With us also, we are blessed to have Sarah, who is a candidate at Harvard Law School. Her research focuses on feminist theory and practice in international law and development. She's currently working on a doctoral dissertation which explores how transnational feminist efforts shaped understanding of forced marriage at extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia. That's really a lot there. So we look forward to hearing things coming from Cambodia as far as issues of sexual violence, forced marriage is concerned. Last but not least, we will have Karoliina, who is a master's degree student in peace, mediation, and conflict research at Tampere University. Before studying her master's, starting her studies, she worked at the Namibia and the different East African countries. Also in northern Uganda, where I come from. At some point, we hosted her there. So as you can see, we have a wealth of researchers who will be exploring the state of the field in as far as research on conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys is concerned, but also key findings from what they're doing, as well as challenges that they're grappling and how they have been trying to respond to some of those challenges. But also, as you can see, we have Philipp. I would want to introduce Philipp a bit later, who will be giving us a commentary on the different presentation. Philipp also had the opportunity to visit northern Uganda, where I come from, and he recently launched his book. So we'll reserve that for the second cohort of the conversation. So we will start the conversation right away, as we now have 30 attendees and 7 panelists. And with no order, we shall have Eric trying to usher us through his research. And Eric will have 7 minutes, and so the other panelists. And thereafter, Philipp will also have 7 minutes to give a commentary. And then we shall open the conversation for our participants. Feel free to send your comments, the chat. Unfortunately, for those who would like chats, we have turned it into Q&A, so feel free to be sending your questions in advance, and you can direct them to particular panelists that you might like. And thank you to Gilbert, who is behind the scene, trying to make sure that all your comments do not fall in the cracks. So Eric, the floor is yours. You have 7 minutes to usher us through your research findings. Thank you so much, participants, and please stay with us all through for the 1 hour, 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Anand. And thanks everyone for attending today. I'm really thankful to be here and talk about the research that I've done over the last 4.5 years and also hear about the other people's research. So let's get started. I am at the Center for Gender Studies at the University of London and SOAS, and my PhD research looks at humanitarian organizations in Jordan and how they recognize sexual violence against men and the responses through the medical, mental health, and protection sectors. What I do is I trace the practitioner values and understandings of sexual violence and the gendered assumptions about male victimhood and the impact of knowledge production and how that impacts what humanitarians know and choose not to know about men. So today, I'll briefly talk about the last 4 years of research. And when I started my PhD in 2017, I aimed to conduct an ethnography where I worked at a torture care center in Jordan, doing participant observation of psychologists and physiotherapists for 10 months. The plan included a conversation with men who would be selected by staff, and our conversations would be observed by them. I really believed that for me to not speak to men would perpetuate the silence that I aimed to critique. And so that was an ongoing conversation that I was having with the ethics department and with some of my superiors. My superiors were behind my research, but they cautioned that I would likely not receive any ethical approval to speak with men. And so that was one of the more difficult parts, because if I knew that these men were at a torture care facility, I knew that they had been tortured, so I didn't need to talk about the torture. I could talk about what they needed from the humanitarian organizations themselves. But even that was a bit ambiguous. And I had one person accuse me of pursuing pain pornography and using that to argue that I shouldn't interview survivors. And another accused me of harvesting people's stories in the course of the programmatic interventions we were jointly involved in. And another person said that it's a topic men would never speak to me about anyway, and the ethics department would never approve. So there were a lot of people that I respected that I would like some feedback on my research. And the main thing that I was looking to do was kind of shot down. So that was fine. PhDs are like that. So I pivoted my research to investigate humanitarian practitioners' understandings about their work about the topic, because a lot of the research at the moment is on perpetration and also the outcomes of sexual violence, but we don't often look at how do the humanitarians approach the topic and how do they make sense of it? Because these are people that they live in they're from either a Western culture or they're from Jordan, and then they work with these people. And then does that impact the way that they have those conversations with men? So for my fieldwork in Jordan, I received approval to start that ethnography 6 months before I arrived. And on the day I arrived, I received an email from them saying, the person that gave you approval is on medical leave. I've just learned about this. I hope that your PhD is not contingent on working with us. You can't work with us. And I was like, oh my gosh. So then I just met a few practitioners, and those 3 people believed in my project and got the snowball rolling. And I managed to interview 103 different humanitarians that were in the medical sector and protection as well. And I'm using those conversations to complete the thesis. And another thing that I was really quite confident that the organizations would believe in this. And there was, when I returned to the UK, I intended to do a comparative site study. So I included 4 more months of interviews with 33 staff working with refugee men. And I spent 4 months writing up an internal report and included the quotes from the practitioners who experienced some secondary trauma and were really candid about the challenges of their work. I planned to include different findings in my PhD. However, the organization was really concerned with my initial findings of their work with sexual survivors of torture and sexual violence. And so they rescinded their consent to be in the thesis. So that was like 8 months of the overall PhD work that I couldn't include as well. So I was like, oh gosh, but that's also how it goes. So I've got plenty of stuff from Jordan, and I'm nearly done with the thesis at the moment. But it's fascinating the way that organizations look at sexual violence and see it as they're really nervous about what that means about who they are as an organization. So I think more than anything, what I learned over the process is it's crucial to have someone who values your topic and believes in your academic research. I think that I have a lot of friends and family who believe in me, which is wonderful, but to have somebody who really believes in studying sexual violence against men is probably the most important as well. And I think when it comes to the overall research, I learned that in a culture where shame and honor are crucial to identity formation, some organizations attempt to reduce shame and stigma surrounding sexual violence, which is great. However, I think the most profound healing that I noticed takes place when there was a focus on rebuilding honor through the small ways of working with men. And so that could be like by hiring a men to carry sticks, or to create some sort of normalcy where they have shisha tents and they figure out how to be a man, not in a framework that is a female-centered framework for engaging men and boys against gender-based violence. And if that's the primary recruiting place in a gender program is against perpetrating GBV, a lot of men are not going to then say, oh, I'm a victim of gender-based violence, which has been written about in the academic research a lot. And I saw that. So a couple other quick points is doctors and psychologists would often say two things to me. They'd say, I've never had anyone ask me about this. Thank you for researching this. And then immediately they'd say, let me tell you about the 2, 3, 4 clients or people that kept me up at night, that I had nightmares about them, which was useful for the research, but compound that times 100 interviews, I was then like inundated with some of the most traumatic things that a seasoned practitioner had experienced. And so I was like, oh gosh, that's hard. Another thing was I would be pulled into the interviews on 2 occasions. One man receiving therapy was forced to rape his mother and in order to survive. And I asked the therapist, I was trying to figure out the follow-up question. I asked, well, how's his relationship now with his mom? And she said, well, would you rape your mother or choose to die? I was like, oh my gosh, don't include me in this hypothetical. I was like, I guess I would rape my mother. And she's like, yeah, exactly. So how would you think your relationship would be? And I was like, okay, next question. The next time I got pulled in, this is the last thing I'll say before I'm done, is a Jordanian male GBV specialist. He was talking about the prevalence of men in Syria that were forced to witness sexual violence against their wives and sisters and daughters. And he said that in his culture, if the perpetrators entered his home, he would personally and immediately shoot his mother and sister and then himself. And then he asked me if I would shoot my sister and mother. And I was like, I wasn't prepared for that. And I was like, I suppose so. So I think that a lot of the things that came up in the research, I was unprepared for, but also made the ethnography quite rich. So that was my time researching. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Eric. And to our followers who are online, you can only imagine what it meant to be Eric during the time of the ethnography. And especially when you're confronted as a trained narrative therapist with a question, would you rape your mother or choose to die? Would you shoot your sister or choose to die? Of course, as a trained psychologist as well, you don't want to be in those kind of circumstances. So for our attendees, you can only imagine what it means. Also in the context of humanitarian work, for some of us, you have to sit day in, day out listening to some of those stories, not from a research angle, but from a practical perspective, from a therapy perspective. You can also imagine what it means to do this kind of research, especially as a seasoned practitioner, where normally we do not interact a lot with researchers. So it's great to see how humanitarian organizations respond to the issues, and also the outright denial that, are you going to find these men? They're just not there. We've been sitting here. We know what we're talking about. Nobody has ever come out. I think that ushers us into the conversation from Karoliina as a student and a researcher, and also having worked in Namibia. Karoliina, what do you have to say? And connecting from what Eric has discussed and from your research, what do you have to tell our attendees as far as issues of sexual violence against men and boys is concerned? Over to you, Karoliina.
Thank you. And Eric mentioned really valid perspectives that have remained unaddressed among researchers, and it's very, very important to pay particular attention to humanitarian workers and health workers, and do they have skills and capabilities to recognize sexual violence. And this is also actually related to my master's thesis. So I'm currently working on my thesis on conflict-related sexual violence against men in Uganda. And I was actually working in northern Uganda in 2020, and I realized how widespread the sexual violence was during the war, and people are still dealing with the war trauma in local communities. And hence, I also want to emphasize that it's crucial to pay attention to the vulnerabilities of male survivors to confront sexual violence also in post-conflict settings. And it's still happening today as well. Also, Uganda is the third largest refugee hosting country globally, and many refugees from South Sudan and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo are seeking shelter from the country. And based on the recent statistic, there are over 1 million male survivors in the eastern region of DRC. And due to the social norms, cultural beliefs, and domestic legal framework in Uganda, the voices of male survivors are silenced, precluding them from seeking support and receiving justice. Uganda's anti-homosexual legislation and this emblematic of embodied homophobia legitimize systematic violence against sexual minorities and also affect male survivors. Because of the law, sexual acts between men are understood as consensual and defined as a crime by law. Due to the stigmatization, male survivors are referred to as homosexuals and less of a man in Ugandan communities, increasing their risk of experiencing sexual violence after the conflict. They also have limited access to health facilities. Thus, there is no multi-sectoral response at the institutional level to tackle sexual violence against men in Uganda. Therefore, organizations, they play a key role in providing support for male survivors and raising awareness of different forms of sexual violence men facing conflicts. There are a handful of organizations, Ugandan organizations, that tackle conflict-related sexual violence against men. One of these is a Refugee Law Project. Since 1999, the human rights organization has documented different forms of sexual violence male refugees and displaced persons have experienced in war-affected situations. The organization provides counseling sessions for survivors of sexual violence and facilitates training sessions for humanitarians, health workers, and police officers to recognize sexual violence against men. Refugee Law Project also educates their staff members to recognize sexual violence at their work. However, little attention has been paid to the organizations regarding their role in ensuring the support for male survivors, and therefore I focus on them in my thesis. How does the stigma around sexual violence against men affect these organizations, their work and lives? Hence, I have collected my thesis through online semi-structured interviews with the staff members of Refugee Law Project. I have also collaborated with smaller NGOs operating in Uganda to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the resources different organizations have to support male survivors in the country, train their staff members, and also maintain their well-being at their workplace. My thesis focuses on the Ugandan context. However, I want to emphasize that in the global policy framework, conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys has remained unaddressed because of a narrow understanding of the victims and perpetrators of sexual violence. Global campaigns like prevalent gender regimes and also previous research has mainly focused on women and girls. Despite sexual violence is nowadays being well reported, there's a limited understanding of male vulnerabilities and as well LGBTQI+ survivors in conflicts. And this also has affected the available resources and funding organizations have to support male survivors. I can tell a bit about my thesis aims. So I analyzed the skills, tools, practices, and methods Ugandan organizations use to ensure the support for male survivors. In my thesis, I also explore the challenges the staff face in assisting male survivors in Ugandan society. And I have particularly focused on the staff members of the Refugee Law Project. What I realized that a comprehensive understanding of the cultural environment and the use of language in a particular context is one of the critical elements that help recognize and support the survivors of sexual violence. Hence, the Refugee Law Project offers staff workers educational training to deal with the language barrier and interpret the body language of the clients. In different cultural environments, sexual violence is framed and conceptualized differently, as words have their unique meanings in different social, cultural contexts. Moreover, as sexual violence against men has remained excluded, it is more crucial how questions about it are formulated. Thus, in my thesis, I analyzed the needed skills to support survivors in Uganda. I also explore how the diverse cultural backgrounds of the staff members are also considered in their educational training and psychosocial support. And most importantly, I aim to deepen understanding of the stigma around mental health and how the embedded homophobia and the patriarchal structures, colonial legacy, what comes to the mental health policies in Uganda, and masculinity beliefs are interlinked and affect the staff who work closely with male survivors in the Ugandan context. In Uganda, the fear of being identified as someone who has a mental health illness is present in a society. And I claim that this does not only affect male survivors, but also the staff members and the lack of psychosocial support they face in their work. Thus, I analyze how does the stigma and silenced culture around sexual violence against men impact the work of the staff members and their well-being in different organizations, but particularly I focus on the Refugee Law Project. And something I want to mention, during the interviews, many people mentioned that you cannot escape the feeling caused by getting exposed to someone's traumatic memories. And this emotion is always there. It comes out somehow at some point. And the staff members, they recognize the heaviness caused by their work and its impacts on their well-being, and even how their body reacts in certain heavy situations. And of course, an intersectional approach is needed to recognize the differences between organizations, genders, generations, regarding how their work affects their well-being. I also would like to share a few words about the challenges I faced while researching sexual violence against men in Uganda. Firstly, I have had difficulties finding Ugandan researchers who have explored this topic because sexual violence is highly stigmatized in the Ugandan society. And secondly, and more personally speaking, and this also resonates with my position in the research, there is a knowledge gap in my own educational background. There are no courses on needed professional skills and tools to be prepared to work in challenging circumstances, or knowledge on how to take care of yourself while analyzing extremely heavy topics. And this could be also tackled in a more structural way in my studies. And this is also related to my thesis topic. And I would also say that this culture of silence around sexual violence against men is also affecting me, but that's something I need to process more later. Lastly, I would like to add that I have analyzed sexual violence, particularly in the African context. However, I recognize that it is crucial to question the normalization of sexual violence in Western countries. Although like mainstream feminist theories acknowledge that gender is socially constructed and intersect with power relations, the concept of gender is embedded and reproduced by colonial thinking, as Maria Lugones has emphasized. And I need to question my own position in these discussions, and a self-reflective approach is crucial to recognize the bias in my own thinking regarding my thesis. But I hope this presentation raised some questions and comments, and I'm still in the process of putting all the puzzles together. But I would like to say thank you for listening, and I am looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Karoliina. And looks like in your research, as if you agreed with Eric. Eric asked a question: how do humanitarian actors respond to these kind of issues? And looks like you picked up very interestingly from there to actually make a visit to organizations, including Refugee Law Project, where Philipp, who is here with us, was also based here with us. And he's also glad to see that people that supported your work, including Dr. Chris Dolan, is right here among the attendees. And people like Mugi Wagorach, for all the mobilization done for the field work. These are We call them foot soldiers. These are the people that interact with the male survivors on daily basis. You may not be able to see them, and Francis or Yat, they're all here. These are our counselors. So if Eric was asking what does it take to do this kind of work as a seasoned therapist, you're also asking, are we as researchers ready to deal with what we listen to, what people tell us psychologically? How do we process it? And what impact will it have, not only on our findings and our writings, but in terms of our day-to-day professional life? I think we'll pick up from there. And as you can see, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered, including the difficulties of male survivors in accessing and uptaking services due to limited funding, and many organizations do not really understand the modalities of how to work with them. Also, things to do with state-sponsored homophobia. Uganda, in so many ways, have been very controversial on issues to do with same-sex relations. So what does that mean for male survivors who have to get services and then you risk being called homosexual? And also the paucity of organizations, and very few organizations are directly working on this kind of issues, and very few researchers at the ground level in Uganda. So it's a whole lot of work, and we hope that you will still come back outside the PhD to continue doing this kind of research. It opens quite a lot of conversation, and I'm glad that people like Suvai Nyon is also here with us. They have been also interacting with male survivors. I'm sure in the comment sections and during Q&A, they'll be able to come in also to share their experience and maybe advise on a few other things. At this time, we will connect to Sanjukta, and I think it connects quite interestingly to say, how do we locate victimhood and the male survivors in the context of international relation? I think, interestingly, the dots are all connecting. So Sanjukta, forgive my pronunciation. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I am very grateful to be a part of this conversation. I think it's important that for us as a researcher who is working on a topic like male victims, which is one less, people do not talk about male victims as much as all. There's lots of awareness on the idea. And when you start working, you kind of think, I think you are alone. So it's very important to know that you have a community where you can come back to ask questions, get some insight, support. That's important. So my work, as Onan just said, it's an exploratory work. Although I thought of doing an ethnographic work too, doing some kind of ethnographic research, but could not, because because of the pandemic and the two massive lockdown that my country had. So we could not. So I had to, after my proposal was passed, I had to reshape my thesis twice, how to justify your work. How do you think you can still do your work without ethnography? Then also, I think I'd like to start from the initial phases of even getting clearance to do work. Being a female researcher working on male victims, do you think it's easy for you to talk to? That was one of the initial questions that I was getting to. Do you think, are you in a position to even talk about? Do you think, is it even secure enough for you to go out and talk to people? Do you think, will you get people to talk to you? How? So these were initial inhibitions, I think, but somehow I got it cleared. And there was also one thing, it's so funny to say that there was an urge that I should keep my research as objective as possible. So I had to change the title of it too. Where I initially said, yes, there's a marginalization of male victims, it ended up saying, I am assessing whether there is a marginalization. So the whole idea that you are supposed to be objective doing it, when you see there are clear-cut, some ways you can say that, yes, there is a marginalization, but do you think there are reasons? Reasons can be different, but why not say upfront there's a marginalization? There's a fear, I guess, if you agree that there's a marginalization at front. I think that was something initially that I had to face. Second, I think I am the only one who is working on this topic in my country. When I'm saying this on male victims of sexual violence, calling it sexual violence, not calling it torture, not looking at boys' sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, but calling it sexual violence. And there are works, I will not deny that there had not been any works in my country, there have been, but it is either in terms of custodial torture, state torture, or at best boys' exploitation. So initially, the hurdle that I faced was to connect to people. How do you start a thing? You have a massive PhD topic and all, how do you really start? Where do you start? You need your supervisor do help you. I have a very supportive supervisor. She does give me very insight. But what beyond that? How do you talk to? What are the things? And the people you got to talk to, like I spoke to people who were from the Indian contingency of peace building, who went there. How do they? But nobody comes up. You cannot talk to them. Like if you ask something, they will either keep it and do not respond to you directly. They will not tell you. And sometimes they will be like, but why? Why do you really want to do something like that? So, but I am happy to do a work where I am currently just relating it. Relating it with the discipline of it, where I could find that since long 2013 there is a conversation, constant conversation, where there has been a conversation that male victims are marginalized. We need to talk about it. But surprisingly, as late as 2022, if you look at the reports, United Nations reports and annual reports, you still see in the cover pages there are females. There's hardly any representative of male victims. So sometimes, so this is something which my research is looking at. Do you think there is a marginalization? How do you link men in the broader context of gender and violence? Somewhere that was very important, because whenever we talk about gender, we just conflate with women. So I remember I attended a conference in UK, and I was in a panel and I was telling them about my experience and how I got letters of people suffering custodial torture in the country and the different acts being done. Okay, fine. Then I also asked them in a conversation with feminist scholars working on gender, how do you think? Do you think there's a conflation of gender and women? They're like, it's a very complicated thing to say. I cannot tell you. I'm like, okay. And by the way, if you're working on men, be sure that you are not creating a competitive victimhood, which was quite surprising me in the beginning, because what do you mean by competitive victimhood? There is already a binary in the system where you have normalized the violence against women, and you do not look at gender violence, basically, which is not women. So it's not only men, boys, other non-binary people. You look at it or you club it together. Somewhere you see that the problems are the same, maybe the same. So you have one response for all. So if I talk about something, I do not need to justify that I am creating a binary or a competition, but rather the fact that it's a holistic thing. I think in one of my conversation with Chris and Alistair, they were like, it's a part of a cake. It's nobody's sharing each other's cake. You all have a part. It's about the victims and their rights, not the gender. You have to move beyond it. And small thing, I think another thing that I currently am facing was to find an external to check my draft. So I think I talk with my supervisor is like, most of them are working on women and gender. You getting a supervisor is quite difficult. And then, although we got external, thankfully, I was talking to Glenn, and Glenn is like, why don't you send it to somebody else? And I'm like, no, we cannot do it. We have to send it to people who are doing in the country, like researcher who is in the country and something. There are some kind of nitty-gritties. But there is still an inhibition that has been telling me, like, there's a discussion that how will you still define why every path you have to justify why men. I feel every path you have to justify why men. Why not women? Because so that is something, it's still there. Even there's a discussion, conversation, people are agreeing, yes, happening. But how do you stop this justification? Thanks, I think, yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Sanjukta, and we can clearly see from your face how the challenges you had to grapple with, both at university level, at the field level. You raised a number of questions, and I'm glad that Phil is actively wrestling university students after being wrestled in the field himself, and Dr. Chris is here, and other researchers online. A number of things are raised, and there's a lot of conversation around, does it take to be one gender to do research on that particular gender? Why are you a woman doing work with men? We have a billion issues to deal with as far as challenges of women and girls are concerned. Why are you moving to the other camp? We still have women dying in hospitals. So when it goes down that narrative, I can only imagine what Sanjukta will say, because it goes quite sentimental and quite personal, and then you have all these difficulties. But then from our work, we also see that some of the survivors or victims prefer to speak to the opposite gender, others prefer to speak to the same gender. So that's why we have a blend of professionals with which our clients can choose from. But also for lecturers here, could it be that the universities are also struggling with a limited number of supervisors on particular sets of issues, or it is not a university interest per se? It's a number of things. I'm sure all these professors here with us at some point will be able to ratio in. But like you said, it's not a binary fight. It's not a competition. The marginalization is real. And unless one gender is on the equation is incomplete. So a number of things there raised, and I'm sure Devota Noah is also here. They'll ask you, what does it mean to be a co-director at Refugee Law Project, how to advance conversation to do with sexual violence against men and boys. And for our attendees, their questions, please, Eric, you have some questions. There's one from Madeline. They're wondering if the panelists, this is for all of you, can speak on how they plan or have to disseminate research back to the areas or to the participants that the organization work on. And this is critical because sometimes we deal with what we call the research fatigue. Participants tell you, yeah, the other time somebody came from Ukraine, did the research, another one came from Kenya, talked to us, but we never see them later. We don't know what happens. So it's really important because what you do today also matters and informs on how other researchers will be able to be welcomed and do their study. Our participants online, keep the comments coming, keep the questions coming. And we are going last to Sarah. Sarah is now going to ground the conversation and connect all the dots. It's not easy to be the last speaker after all the others have spoken. I don't know what Phil will have to say after all this conversation, but now trying to explore how transnational feminist effort shape understanding of forced marriage. This is a very new area of work. Sarah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wish I could connect all the dots. I don't think I'm capable of that because the research that's just been presented is fantastic, wide-ranging, and I'm in awe of it. So I'm only going to claim that I can speak to my research and my research experiences, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion helping us connect those pieces. So I study the prosecution of sexual and gender-based violence at the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. That's a mouthful. We call it the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. It's a lot easier. And I initially came to this research because I was interested in how sexual violence is addressed through international criminal law and how that then affects the work of NGOs and donors in those societies where the tribunals are being held or that the tribunals concern. And when I came to this, I shared what is, I think, a widespread, I don't say correct, but widespread understanding of women as the primary victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And it was actually researching the prosecution of sexual and gender-based crimes at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal that helped me question that understanding and actually turn that understanding into a research topic for me. So I think having some reflexivity in your research is helpful, and having supervisors and commentators who will say, why do you think that, can be really helpful. And the South-South Institute and this community is wonderful for that. So I've been asking how and why did that understanding of conflict-related sexual violence, the one that stems largely from a concern with addressing how conflicts affect women, how did that feature in the prosecutions at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal? And I sought to answer this by developing a detailed history of how discourses around sexual and gender-based violence emerged and developed in the context of the tribunal. This meant analyzing tens of thousands of pages of NGO documents, research, working papers, legal documents, trial transcripts, and then the most exciting aspect for me was conducting around 50 interviews with a range of professionals involved in this process. Again, I would say that IRB process is a challenge. I would think about it as early on as you possibly can, and we can talk about that more in the discussion. And so what I found is that a year or two into the tribunal's work, transnational feminist researchers and advocates, so feminist researchers and advocates who work internationally, primarily not Cambodian, began to criticize the tribunal's inaction regarding sexual and gender-based crimes. And they increasingly undertook their own studies and outreach to document and bring attention to those crimes, which they saw as particularly impacting women. And those crimes were sexual and gender-based violence crimes. I do think it's really important to note here that many of those feminist researchers and advocates did acknowledge that men too suffered from sexual and gender-based violence under the Khmer Rouge. They worked with some male victims too, but the majority were women. And typically what I've seen is that while they acknowledged that men were victims and that further research was needed to document and understand men's experiences, their primary constituency continued to be women. And funding from donors, I think, encouraged that as well, encouraged that focus. And so these researchers and advocates looked into rape, forced pregnancy, experiences of motherhood during the Khmer Rouge. But when the tribunal did finally prosecute a couple of sexual and gender-based crimes, and it only prosecuted 2, those were crimes that by their very nature affected similar numbers of men and women. Those crimes were forced marriage and the forced consummation of those marriages, so being forced to have sex. The Khmer Rouge would pair up civilian men and civilian women, force them to marry in mass ceremonies. And then those newlywed couples very often were either explicitly threatened or felt implicit pressure to have sex because they feared that they would be killed if they didn't, that it would be seen as disobedience. The trial chamber entered convictions for those crimes, but something very interesting and troubling happened in those convictions. It distinguished between male and female victims. And bear with me on the legal stuff here. I'm telling you what was decided. I'm not giving a normative statement on the trial chamber here. I'm not supporting their finding. The trial chamber found that forced consummation was tantamount to rape for women and that it caused them to suffer sufficiently to count as a crime against humanity. There's a certain threshold of suffering that the trial chamber thought needed to be reached. And it noted things like loss of virginity and the associated stigma of that for women to explain how women suffered enough. But when it came to men, things were different. The trial chamber ruled that men couldn't be considered rape victims because the men were not penetrated. They were doing the penetrating, even though it was against their will. So the trial chamber asked whether the men could be seen as victims of sexual violence. And it said that it didn't have the evidence to find that men suffered enough from sexual violence to count as victims of a crime against humanity. So women did, men did not. And I hope that sounds disappointing and surprising to a lot of you, but having studied how these crimes came to be prosecuted, I don't think it's actually all that surprising. I found that fairly early on in the process of advocacy and adjudication of sexual and gender-based crimes, men were increasingly acknowledged alongside women as also being victims, but efforts to understand how and why that caused men to suffer were scarce. I think this was exacerbated by the facts of forced consummation, because understandings of rape that I think are dominant in international law and development understand it as something men do to women and as a tool of patriarchy. And that doesn't get us very far in understanding what it must be like as a man to be forced to have sex with someone else who is also unwilling. But I think that's the paradigmatic understanding that still persists in these sectors. I don't have a lot of time left, but I think other people here are students who might be interested. So I'll just note that I found Chris's article in the Red Cross Review and Karen Engel's work on this to be incredibly helpful and grounding. So I would recommend those. But I'm going to end on a note of cautious optimism. A central part of my research has been those interviews with professionals to build up an oral history of what they remember and what their views are of those efforts to prosecute and redress sexual and gender-based violence. My impression from that is that the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of people as individuals are open to thinking deeply and compassionately about men as victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And I found that what poses the greater challenge to them is how embedded it is in the institutions and in the sectors and in the sort of professional ways of working and thinking. There's still this embeddedness of sexual violence being something that men do to women. And I think dismantling that will take a more concerted and much more painstaking, granular effort. But I think events like today's sure that there is a willingness to do that, and maybe it's something we can discuss together. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. To all our attendees, as you can clearly follow the conversation, there's some degree of optimism, but also some degree of frustration. If we really seem to understand that there are challenges that men and boys are grappling with, why do we see a very gendered legal system? And it's interesting, maybe could be another area to explore. You've not suffered enough. And how does that then amount to crime against humanity? You weren't penetrated. So it gets us back to the conversation of very, very fundamental questions about who suffered. And people use their own positionality to ascertain that you have suffered most, therefore you have a particular label. And I'm glad that Alastair Hilton himself is here. He has really been wrestling the conversation in Cambodia. He has also posted a very lengthy note there for all of you, and more from Dr. Chris there, how you've been wrestling the ethics review. And I think it's interesting how Sarah brings us the conversation around the legal component of the discourse. In Uganda, for now, even for a man to wake up and say, I've been raped, our law book is still a bit silent about that. We hope that the sex offences bill will try to do some substantive coverage. As we can see, we're coming to Phil now, as I see our participants, our attendees are very hungry with many questions coming. They're interested in getting to know a lot more. Phil, who is here, is a postdoctoral researcher. I said I will introduce him a bit later, at the Institute for Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen. He was previously affiliated with Refugee Law Project as a research associate. And about a week or two ago, he launched his book. I didn't have the opportunity to attend, but from the media coverage, the local news, it was really great. And it was titled Male Survivors of Wartime Sexual Violence, Perspectives from Northern Uganda. I think Phil's research comes at the time of when people were like us were just being born. So please get some time and buy a copy. I think at the beginning you just have to buy, or Sweet Talk Phil to have a copy to read. Phil, the floor is yours to give a commentary, having had very exhaustive, I must say, very extensive research going on, and also you've been in the field now as a teacher or a lecturer at the university, also doing research. What do you have to say as we try to wind up the conversation? Thank you. Phil, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shannon, for organizing this and for inviting me along, in addition to Gilbert and everyone else behind the scenes who's been part of that. And then thank you so much to our 4 wonderful panelists for these really rich and candid and enlightening reflections and presentations of your work. It's such a pleasure to be able to sit here among you and with you and listen to you. And there's really so much richness in your work and your research and in your reflections. And I appreciate you being open and honest and sharing these experiences. But then also I appreciate you making my job a little bit easier as moderator here, because you've already done a brilliant job at sort of moderating and commenting on some of these presentations as we went along. So part of me feels tempted to just say what Onen said, because you've captured that really well, but I think there's some points I want to highlight here, and I promise to not take up too much space and then have enough space for a discussion amongst all of us. I think it's really great that we have this space, because I think it's often precisely MA or PhD students and early career researchers who are at the very forefront of conducting novel empirical research and driving methodological innovation, yet we too rarely listen to these experiences and also generally offer way too little space for training, preparation, and support prior to, during, and after the research, which I think is something that also came out of the presentations we've just been able to listen to. And so I think creating this space here is really crucial and important in that regard of fostering that conversation and having a chance to listen to those who are doing this type of work and who are sort of, driving that innovation there. Something that seems to sort of cut across most of your presentations and experiences here, at least from my interpretation of it, is that issue of unsupportive supervisors, of unsupportive institutions, and the general absence that there is of proper support networks to do this type of work. And we've heard that from the presentations, but I think also for those in the audience doing work on this topic, many of us, if not most, recall instances of being told that this will not be possible, or they won't speak to you, or questioning the value of this type of work, of this research, of what's really sort of in there, why this would be necessary, rather than supporting it. And this assumption that I think Eric has shared, that and others as well, that they won't speak with you anyway, is so incredibly patronizing and essentialist. And I think it further, contributes towards denying survivors any agency, power, or control in this regard. And it's framed as like an act of care, of wanting to protect them. And I think this speaks to the comment that Chris made. But I think, in fact, what's sort of really at stake here is trying to protect the institution behind that, rather than being really candid or concerned about the safety of those involved in that, and instead perpetuating these very harmful and patronizing stereotypes. And so I think in many ways, these unsupportive structures require structural changes in that regard, in terms of creating support structures and networks. But also, I think maybe raise the importance of the necessity of sensitization and awareness raising among academics and supervision staff on how to support this type of work, especially for those who have very limited or no experience dealing with topics of this sort, or this particular topic. And I think, and then you've also mentioned this before, I think the sort of expertise on this topic is not necessarily something that is highly thought after in many institutions. And so I think there's often a gap between students wanting to pursue such work and there not being any resources to support them in doing that. And the result is that students have often to find ways and figure it out themselves without having any of that support. Now, within that absence of support at that level, I think it's all the more crucial to find and create and build support networks and structures and communities of care in which some of that support can be granted maybe on a peer-to-peer level. For me, for instance, my affiliation with RP has been such a resource, as well as other maybe more semi-official networks with other early career researchers and PhD students where we can exchange about these experiences. One of you has also pointed out that the South-South Institute can be seen as yet another such space where support is offered, really sort of countering, I think, the absence at other levels. As Eric said very eloquently, there's really value in having a community of people who support our work, and I think that cannot be emphasized enough. Another aspect that I picked up on in your presentation concerns the value, but also perhaps the challenges of institutional affiliations and collaborations in doing this type of work, both in terms of being able to situate the research in an ongoing sort of process of working on this topic, as it has been the case for those of us who have had the privilege and pleasure to collaborate with RLP over the years, but then also some of the challenges that may come with that. And I think Eric pointed that out in terms of maybe dependencies on organizations to build relations and access, but then not being able to sort of materialize that, or that falling through because of individual constraints that some people may have on that kind of work. I think that was sort of something that also stood out to me. I don't want to take up too much space here, but I think one sort of question that maybe would be relevant for all of you to consider, maybe to sort of drive that conversation forward, and feel free to sort of react to that as you see fit. But I'd be curious to hear your reflections about your own positionalities in terms of doing this work, regarding your own gendered, socioeconomic, cultural, but also racialized background of doing this work in a different context than maybe the context that you're from or that you're familiar with, but maybe also doing it in the context that you know, India, for instance, here, and how those positionalities and the different layers of that did affect your research, your relationships, how you think this was perceived by those who maybe participated in your research, sort of moving beyond these simplified assumptions that you also pointed out there, that it's only men who can do this work, it's only women who can do this work, it's only locals or only foreigners who can do that. You know, I think there's like a variety of factors that come together and that are layered upon each other that I think make up our positionalities and change or influence not if we can do this work, but how we can do that. And I'd be curious to hear what you think of that, what your experiences are of that. There's other points I think I could pick up on, but maybe I'm going to draw this to a close here and hand it back to you, and open the discussion, and then we can maybe return to that. But I want to end again and emphasize how grateful I am for the invitation and for having had the chance to listen to your experiences and learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phil. With the recent book, I can see it is open source, so please, colleagues and attendees, please have a copy before they put a price tag to it. That's normally what happens. So let's enjoy the honeymoon of the publication. And there are a number of questions that have come in the Q&A. Please, our attendees, others, I know they want to talk, but please send your questions. I would like to draw the attention of Sanjukta to a question from Dr. Chris. Dolan, which is to all of you, but do you think the ethic process was more for your protection or the protection of your respondents or of your institution? So as we wait for more comments coming in from the attendees, please, Sanjukta, if you could start wrestling with that as we come to questions from Suvai, and maybe also Sarah to wrestle one from anonymous attendee as we get others, and also Eric to respond to give additional words to Alastia Hilton's comment. Over to you, Sanjukta.
I think as Philip just ended his thing, I think it's related not only to the protection of an institution, it's where the institution is located. Where, as a researcher, you're coming from, which region. For example, if I'm coming from a global south country, right now, the more research has been doing, that has been done or has been funded is on high politics, foreign policy, security issues. Gender issues is also mostly protection of girl, child, woman. So there's not enough fund or not a recognition, because they think this is something that can be talked about later. So somewhere they cloud the whole thing. Do you think that you will be enough protected to go and talk to? Plus they're saving their back also, like how they will justify that somebody is working. So it's not as simple as an answer. I think it's both. I think where you are located as a researcher, where your institution is located, and as usual, do you think this is going to have a conversation, something which do you think the institution is supporting you? So I think in my case, it was more to do with my protection and the institution protection. I think that was there. It was not like, will you be safe enough? Because we do not have enough idea or a practice. Nobody's training a thing how to deal with it. How will you do? Where will you do? How do you conduct the research? It's such a sensitive issue. How do you do that? Plus being a female researcher. I think it's a combination of both.
Right. Thank you so much, Sanjukta. I think these are some of the controversial conversation. In whose interest, for whose benefit is that? And normally when you ask researchers, does the informed consent benefit the researcher or the respondent in real sense, or both, and how? These are questions that we need to put on the table, and thank you so much for your response. I will get to Sarah to try to wrestle one on, from an anonymous attendee. Do the panelists have any useful, successful example how they were able to overcome some of the challenges around you've not suffered enough? Sarah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I think this is a wonderful question, and I want to be clear that I agree that it is astonishing. To say that it's not surprising isn't to diminish how problematic it is. It's just to call attention to how baked into the systems of international law and its jurisprudence that this is. And this is a great question. I only have a partial answer to it, but I think it's a helpful example is I think a really good effort I saw came from the prosecution at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal when they appealed that finding, and we're still waiting for the appeal judgment, but in their appeal, they simply very directly, point by point, called out what they think are the assumptions that contribute to believing that men didn't suffer enough. And those assumptions were things that I think sometimes we can be too reluctant to talk about, such as the assumption that people are straight. I think that's a really big assumption behind a lot of this, is the assumption that people are heterosexual, the assumption that within heterosexual sexual situations, that no matter what the conditions are for men, this is a win, this is a good thing, they must enjoy it, they must see it as a benefit. I think calling that out, once you just say it quite clearly, people see what a preposterous idea it is to assume that no matter the circumstances, having sex with a woman is seen as a good thing for men. And I think we can be sometimes too reluctant to simply say that. So I think that's a good start, but I'm sure that other panelists have many other ideas.
All right, thank you. We'll wish that all the panelists would have the opportunity to respond to that, but we have about 14 minutes to bring this to a close. Maybe I'll move to Karoliina. There's a question from Suvai Nyoni about your interaction with staff of especially refugee law project, and she's asking, there's a bit of curiosity on some of the findings, so those that you can share online here. Over to you, Karoliina. Then I'll come to Eric to try to address Jared's question. So just to prepare for that. Karolina?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for the curiosity. Of course, at the moment, I'm still putting my puzzles together, as I mentioned, so I can only provide preliminary findings. But in my thesis, my aim is to focus on the staff members. I mentioned because of the limited research of their limited research and understanding of their role in supporting, ensuring support for male survivors. And because sexual violence against men in Uganda is highly stigmatized, and it's a very silent topic in the Ugandan society, I analyze this interconnection, how this affects the staff members, how it affects those tools that are available in their work, practices they are able to implement with the male survivors, how this also affects their well-being. And one of the things that I learned when I connected the readings and the data I was analyzing, that there is a stigma around mental health. And it's interlinked with patriarchal structures and masculinity beliefs and the colonial legacy. And all this is affecting male survivors as well. And as I mentioned, because of the stigma and the legislation and the shame, they are not able to openly talk about their experiences. But this also affects the staff workers who are supporting male survivors. Could I say that they somehow carry the stigma because they don't have like psychosocial support is not available for them because of lack of resources, but also because of lack of stigma around mental health as well. And all these different factors are affecting the well-being of the staff workers. For example, vicarious trauma are quite common among humanitarians, and as well those like the knowledge as well, what comes to sexual violence against men and those different skills that are needed while ensuring the support for male survivors. So these are my preliminary findings, and of course, when my thesis is completed, I will share it with you. But this is maybe all I can say at the moment.
Thank you so much, Karolina. Time is not on our side. We have about 9 more minutes before we bring this to a close. But it's interesting to hear some of the findings. I see Salome Awidi here online, Mogi Wagoraj, our team from Lamour, Kiriandonga, Germany, including our head of programs, who is also now a co-director. These are some of the recommendations and findings that we will work closely to see that we don't get burnout from staff. I will come to the question from Jared. Eric, they're wondering if you could speak the difference between unsupportive versus antagonistic structures and how they have been encountered in attempting to design studies. Over to you, Eric. Then I'll come back to Sarah in a bit about how you can convince learners that erection doesn't mean consent. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jarrett. I think that the unsupportive versus the antagonistic is something that within my personal construction of my thesis, I didn't have too much antagonistic pushback when it came to who I was going to talk to. It wasn't malicious. It was more practical in terms of how are you going to do what you want to do and jump through the hoops necessary in order to complete your PhD. And yeah, I'm trying to think. When I was just writing my notes on this, I was thinking the conversations that I had with a lot of UN agency workers, those would be that they wanted me to frame whatever work I found in regard to how whatever foundation I had, that it needed to be based on women being disproportionately impacted, and that was it. That there was no other way to look at sexual violence and conflict without the roots of patriarchy being the framework for it. And so I found a lot of more the antagonism in the field with the actual humanitarian apparatus, more so than at my institution. When I think about my IRB, I just kind of typed up something and it got approved in like a week. I don't even know if they read it, to be honest. So that made my life really quite easy. I was just thinking about Sarah, like, oh yeah, the IRB. For me, it was great. I've had supervisors that have shaped my project enough that I haven't had many hurdles in that regard. I wanted to go back to what I think Alistair had said about creating safe spaces and opportunities real quick, that men do want to talk. And one thing that I encountered a lot was that people said that men don't need safe spaces because men are safe on the street, that women need safe spaces because they're not safe on the street. And so, and I would counter that and I'd say, yeah, but men can't really have this emotional safe space. And they said, yeah, but men are safe. And so there was this complete dismissing of having a specific place for men to feel that they could emotionally engage with each other. And they also said men won't attend a safe space, as if it needed to be called that. And I think that it doesn't need to be called that. And other thing that the humanitarian apparatus kind of wants is that everything needs to be named and quantified, but men don't want things named and quantified. And so if you have a program that needs to have a certain number of people, and then they report to the donors how many people attended their services, a lot of men that I noticed, they don't want to be quantified and turned into some report. They want to go there and receive services that aren't public, I guess. So great question about the antagonism and the unsupportive. I don't know if I answered that, but it is very much something that I encountered in the field.
Thank you so much, Eric, for giving us the real field experience on what it means to encounter some of those issues. We'll come to question from Cosmos Logala, who is English for Adult team leader at the Refugee Law Project based in Kiriandongo, that is wrestling to convince his learners, who are refugees and hosts, who are adults, that erection is not necessarily a consent to sex, but a physiological response. Over to you, Sarah. I think that was directed to you.
Yeah, Cosmos, it's such a great question and such an important issue. I do want to be very careful because I don't provide direct services to people who've been through this. So I certainly don't have expertise on how to explain this to people who've been through it or to their family or people who know them. But what I can say is that we have seen in pretty much any conflict that people under threat of death, under threat of death to a family member or to another person, they will be able to get an erection and to complete sexual intercourse, penetrative sexual intercourse. We've seen that time and time again. So I think the most I could say is there is plenty of evidence to support that it is a physiological response and that people are hardwired for survival, and it is about survival. But I think there are probably other people within the network who are better qualified than me to put that in ways that are more helpful for an adult learner. So I can just say that it's an incredibly important question, but I'm probably not the best person to answer it, but it's really important.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. Indeed, it is quite a challenge to explain to people the physiological response, not necessarily being consent. I see Phil here also wanting to add a voice to the question from Jared about unsupportive versus antagonistic structures. Over to you, Phil, as we try to wrap this up. Thank you.
Thanks. I do want to avoid being the last person to say something, though, because I think there's so much richness in what every one of you has contributed. I just wanted to emphasize, and I think side with Eric, that this is a great question and a great distinction to sort of point out that, yes, I mean, there may be unsupportive structures, maybe, you know, because of a lack of resources or a lack of interest, but there's also so much antagonistic responses, you know, whether within institutions, within sort of, networks or supervision structures, but also within the field of scholarship more largely. So like, I think the examples you've pointed out about the policing of, you know, whenever you write something about it, you have to start with the premise of making sure that you do know that women and girls are most heavily affected and disproportionately affected. And you have to start with establishing numbers about this, ideally, to really prove that this exists. And, you know, that's a task that's not sort of given or requirement for other work on this topic. And so like the antagonism, I think, is often very implicit. I think oftentimes it's also explicit. And it's something I think that sort of polices the whole work and the advocacy, the research that's being done about that, and doesn't make it easier, I think, for anyone involved here. And again, I think it's based upon binary understandings of it, on false assumptions, on stereotypes that I think underpin all of the work that you have pointed out and do. I'm sure there could be more to be said about that. But let's turn it back to you, Anin.
All right, thank you so much. There's still some questions coming. I see anonymous attendees saying, thanks, Eric. There is a time to complete. There's definitely a complete disconnect in the understanding of realities. Jared is saying those are such a finding. And very interestingly, from Zakaya Ochan, who is saying, thank you for your great submissions. He's a video advocate under Refugee Law Project, and he's actually using music to help survivors heal from the different trauma that they're encountered and they're going through. And maybe, I think Jakara is saying, is there research on the connection between trauma and music as a form of therapy for healing? As a seasoned therapist, Eric, maybe you'll have the last word. We have 3 minutes. Could there be anything that can be advanced in as far as music is concerned to help survivors deal with the day-to-day challenges in the absence of therapists? There are many and there are very few therapists in the humanitarian world. If you have anything to say as a therapist, as we wind this up.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, the thing is that music is going to connect people on a community level and also resonate deeply within their actual body. And so if you think about the frequencies that we have that are peaceful frequencies, that is actually going to calm somebody's nervous system down. And so if you have music that somebody can participate in, something that is actually like a calming frequency, they're going to, if you think about the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system and what they have gone through and how they're in the fight or flight mode, trying to get that calm is probably the most important thing so that they can have a daily function where they're not completely stressed. Stress is something that they're going to, I mean, if you have sexual violence, your pelvic floor is going to be it depends. It could be a fistula, but your pelvic floor is going to be so tight or so loose. And so even your whole body is tensed up. So having some sort of music where they can create something, where they can participate in a group, where they can build that connection, rebuilding human connection is the most important thing. Because a lot of these people, one woman who's been a therapist for 30 years, she said, Eric, these people have been harmed and tortured in the hands of other people, and they can be healed in the hands of other people. And so who are we going to be, and what can our hands do with these people? And I thought, oh my gosh. Yeah. So I think that we have a responsibility as researchers, we have a responsibility as just lay people and civilians to just love people well and care about them and treat them as a normal human being, because that's all they want is normalcy and honor, and to not feel the shame, and to not focus on that. So yeah, music is incredibly important. It builds connection. It builds like just calmness. That's what we want, I don't know. That's my opinion. I'm not doing this work because I want some PhD. I think that we all are creating something amazing. We're putting something out in the universe and in the whole academic space for healing. Yeah. So that's what I think this is about more than anything.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. As a seasoned therapist there, it's exactly 15 hours in Uganda, and we have come to a closer of this session. And for our attendees, thank you for being steady with us. I must say it has been interesting on trying to look deeply into what does it mean to research sexual violence against men and boys, the students' perspective. And to all our panelists, I must believe that and also suppose that it wasn't very easy to wrestle to some of the questions, but that opens new space for new conversation and for additional research. I look forward to welcoming you again on 16th of June when we'll be talking about international and domestic legal frameworks and emerging case laws. Ken Clearwater is here with us, Salome Awidi, and many others to be confirmed. Thank you so much, our participants and our attendees. Thank you so much, people behind the scene, Gilbert and team, all the staff of RLP and other humanitarian actors and development actors that are online, and to all our international guests. Thank you for being with us for all these hours. We look forward to seeing you again Thank you so much. South Institute really appreciates your time. We look forward to seeing you again. Please continue to visit our YouTube page, our social media, especially Facebook. I know it is blocked in Uganda, but for other participants, they should be able to access that. Other communication will follow through email. Until next time, see you again. Bye.